The dust clung to Josephine Winters' dress like a second skin as she clutched her youngest brother's thin hand, the gnawing hunger in her stomach almost unbearable. 3 days without food had made each step along the barren trail more difficult than the last, and her two brothers, only 8 and 10 years old, were fading fast under the merciless Texas sun of 1875. "Just a little further, Samuel, Timothy," she whispered, her voice cracking from thirst. "We'll find help soon." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. Since their parents' death from fever 2 weeks ago, they had been wandering, searching for work or shelter. Finding neither, Timothy, the youngest, stumbled and fell to his knees. His small face, once round with childish softness, had hollowed. Samuel, slightly older but equally frail, helped Josephine pull their brother to his feet. His eyes met hers with a silent question she couldn't answer. How much longer could they survive? The distant thunder of hooves interrupted the desolate silence. Josephine tensed, pulling her brothers behind her. Travelers could mean help or danger for a young woman and 2 small boys alone in the wilderness. A cloud of dust appeared on the horizon, gradually revealing a solitary rider. As he approached, Josephine could make out a broad-shouldered silhouette, the unmistakable wide-brimmed hat of a cowboy shadowing his face. "Stay behind me," she murmured to her brothers, straightening her spine despite her weakness. She wouldn't show fear, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. The rider slowed his chestnut stallion as he neared them, and Josephine caught her first clear glimpse of his face. Sun-bronzed skin, a strong jaw partially hidden by several days' worth of stubble, and eyes the color of a summer storm gray with hints of blue. He couldn't have been more than 30. "Madam," he said, tipping his hat. His gaze swept over her threadbare dress, then to the 2 small boys clutching at her skirts. "You folks look like you could use some help." "We're managing just fine, sir," Josephine replied, the stubborn pride that had kept them moving these past weeks not allowing her to admit their desperation. A faint smile touched the cowboy's lips. "No offense intended, madam, but you don't look fine." He dismounted in one fluid motion, revealing his impressive height. "Name's Mitchell Blackwood. I own the Double B Ranch about 5 miles east of here." Timothy chose that moment to sway on his feet. Mitchell moved with surprising speed for a man his size, catching the boy before he hit the ground. "Your brother needs food and water," he said, his voice gentler than his weathered appearance suggested. "All of you do." Josephine wanted to protest, but Timothy's limp form in the stranger's arms silenced her objections. This man, this cowboy, might be their only chance at survival. "Can you ride?" Mitchell asked, already lifting Timothy onto his horse. "Yes," Josephine answered, though it had been years since she'd been on horseback. "Good." He helped Samuel up next, positioning him securely in the saddle. Then he turned to Josephine, his strong hands encircling her waist as he lifted her effortlessly behind her brothers. "Hold tight," he instructed, taking the reins and beginning to lead the horse on foot. "Double B isn't far, but it'll be sunset by the time we arrive." The journey passed in a haze for Josephine, the steady rhythm of the horse's gait almost lulling her to sleep despite her determination to remain alert. True to Mitchell's word, the sun was setting when a sprawling ranch house came into view, surrounded by several smaller structures and expansive corrals. "Welcome to Double B," Mitchell said, glancing back at her with those storm-gray eyes. "Not much to look at, but there's plenty of food and clean beds." As they approached, a stocky older woman emerged from the main house, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mitchell Blackwood, who have you brought home this time?" she called, her voice carrying a hint of amusement despite the concern in her expression. "Found them on the North Trail, Mrs. Hoffman," he answered, helping Samuel down from the horse. "They need food and rest." "I can see that plain as day," Mrs. Hoffman replied, already reaching for Timothy. Her weathered face softened as she took in the boy's condition. "Poor lamb's half-starved." Josephine slid from the horse, her legs nearly buckling beneath her. Mitchell's hand caught her elbow, steadying her with surprising gentleness. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate for the gratitude flooding through her. "No need for thanks," he replied. "Let's get you and your brothers fed." The kitchen was warm and filled with the mouth-watering aroma of stew. Mrs. Hoffman, the housekeeper, Josephine soon learned, wasted no time ladling generous portions into bowls while Mitchell poured fresh milk for the boys. Eat slowly, Mrs. Hoffman cautioned as Timothy and Samuel devoured their food. Your stomachs need time to remember what food is. Josephine tried to follow the advice, but the rich stew was the first real meal they'd had in days. She fought tears as she watched color gradually return to her brothers' faces. Your parents? Mitchell asked quietly, taking a seat across from her. Fever, she replied, setting down her spoon. 2 weeks ago, we were traveling west from Missouri. Father heard there was work in the territories. Mitchell nodded, his expression somber. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you, Josephine murmured, the simple acknowledgement of their tragedy unexpectedly touching. You're welcome to stay here until you get your bearings, he offered. The boys need time to regain their strength. Josephine's pride warred with practicality. They had nowhere else to go, no money, and her brothers needed shelter. I can work, she said firmly. I won't accept charity. Something that might have been respect flickered in Mitchell's eyes. Double B can always use another pair of hands. We'll talk more tomorrow. For now, rest. Mrs. Hoffman showed them to a small but clean room with 2 beds. The boys fell asleep almost instantly, their breathing deep, and even for the first time in days. Josephine stood by the window, gazing out at the ranch bathed in moonlight, wondering what tomorrow would bring in this unexpected sanctuary. Dawn arrived with the sounds of the ranch awakening, distant cattle lowing, horses nickering, men's voices calling to one another as they began their day's work. Josephine dressed quickly in her worn dress, smoothing it as best she could before waking her brothers. Where are we again? Samuel asked, rubbing sleep from his eyes. A ranch called Double B, she answered, helping Timothy with his buttons. The owner has offered to let us stay for a while. The man with the big horse, Timothy asked, his voice stronger than it had been yesterday. Yes, Mr. Blackwood. A knock at the door interrupted them. Mrs. Hoffman entered with a bundle of clothing. These might be a bit large for the boys, but they'll do until we can get something proper, she said, setting the clothes on the bed. And for you, miss. She handed Josephine a simple blue dress. Belonged to Mitchell's sister before she married and moved to Kansas. I couldn't possibly, Josephine began. Nonsense, Mrs. Hoffman interrupted. Can't have you working in that threadbare thing. Breakfast's ready when you are. With that, she bustled out, leaving Josephine holding the dress the nicest she'd seen in months. After changing and helping the boys into their borrowed clothes, they made their way to the kitchen. Mitchell was already there, deep in conversation with an older man who shared his strong jawline and broad shoulders. Pa, this is Miss Josephine Winters and her brothers, Mitchell said as they entered. Miss Winters, this is my father, George Blackwood. The elder Blackwood nodded in greeting. Welcome to Double B, Miss Winters. My son tells me you've had a rough time of it. Yes, sir, Josephine replied, but we're grateful for your hospitality. No need for gratitude, George said, his voice gruff but kind. Mitchell made the right call bringing you here. Breakfast was a hearty affair of eggs, bacon, and biscuits that had the boys eating with enthusiasm. Throughout the meal, Josephine couldn't help noticing Mitchell's occasional glances in her direction, his expression thoughtful. After breakfast, Mitchell suggested showing Josephine around the ranch while Mrs. Hoffman kept an eye on the boys. They could use a day of rest, he said, and I thought you might want to see what kind of work we have available. The Double B was larger than Josephine had realized, over 10,000 acres of grazing land for cattle and horses, with a main house, bunkhouse for the ranch hands, barn, stables, and various other outbuildings. Mitchell walked beside her, pointing out different areas and explaining the ranch operations with evident pride. My grandfather started with just 50 acres and a dream, he told her as they stood overlooking a valley where cattle grazed. Built it into this. Pa expanded it further, and now it's my turn to keep it going. It's impressive, Josephine said sincerely. Our farm in Missouri was nothing like this. You farmed? Mitchell asked. Yes, wheat mostly and some vegetables. We had a few dairy cows too. Memories of home brought a lump to her throat. I helped with everything from milking to harvesting. Mitchell nodded appreciatively. That explains why your hands aren't as soft as most city women's. Josephine glanced down at her work-roughened hands, suddenly self-conscious. I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Blackwood. Mitchell, he corrected. And I never thought you were, Miss Winters. Josephine, she offered in return, surprising herself with the informality. Their tour continued to the vegetable garden behind the main house, where Mrs. Hoffman struggled with some stubborn weeds. I could help with the garden, Josephine suggested, and cooking, cleaning, whatever needs doing. Mitchell considered this. Mrs. Hoffman could use the help, especially with the garden. She's been after me to find someone. He smiled slightly. And I imagine your brothers could use some schooling. Mrs. Hoffman taught my sister and me our letters. The suggestion of education for her brothers touched Josephine deeply. Since their parents' death, practical survival had pushed aside such considerations. They would benefit greatly from that, she agreed. By the time they returned to the house, an arrangement had been reached. Josephine would help Mrs. Hoffman with household duties and the garden, while the boys would have lessons in the mornings and light chores suited to their age and strength in the afternoons. In exchange, they would have room and board, plus a small wage for Josephine. It's more than fair, she told Mitchell as they stood on the porch. More than I expected to find when we set out yesterday morning. Something in his expression softened. Sometimes fate has a way of putting people where they need to be, Josephine. The way her name sounded in his deep voice sent an unexpected warmth through her. She looked away, suddenly flustered. Yes, I suppose it does. The following weeks fell into a rhythm that brought a sense of normalcy Josephine hadn't felt since her parents' deaths. The boys thrived under Mrs. Hoffman's tutelage, gaining weight and color. Samuel showed a particular aptitude for mathematics, while Timothy revealed a natural talent with the ranch's horses, spending every free moment at the stables. Josephine's days were filled with work tending the garden, helping with meals, mending clothes, and assisting Mrs. Hoffman with the endless tasks of running a large household. The physical labor was familiar and oddly comforting, giving her little time to dwell on their losses. Mitchell was often away from the main house, overseeing cattle operations or riding the boundaries of his property. But when their paths crossed, usually at dinner or in the early evenings, Josephine found herself increasingly drawn to his quiet strength and unexpected moments of gentle humor. One evening, about a month after their arrival, Josephine sat on the porch mending one of Samuel's shirts. The setting sun painted the landscape in fiery oranges and reds, the beauty of it momentarily stilling her hands. Quite a sight, isn't it? Mitchell's voice came from behind her. She turned to find him leaning against the doorframe, his tall frame silhouetted by the light from inside. It's beautiful, she agreed. I don't think I'll ever tire of it. He stepped forward, taking a seat in the rocking chair beside her. How are you settling in? Well, I think. The boys are certainly thriving, she set aside her mending. Timothy talks of nothing but horses now, and Samuel is racing through the books Mrs. Hoffman gives him. Mitchell smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. And you, are you finding some peace here, Josephine? The question caught her off guard with its perceptiveness. Yes, I believe I am, though I still worry about our future. That's only natural. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. But you should know you're welcome here as long as you wish to stay. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a current of understanding that made Josephine's heart beat faster. Before she could respond, Timothy burst through the door, excitedly describing the new foal born in the stables that afternoon. The moment passed, but Josephine found herself thinking about it later as she lay in bed. Mitchell Blackwood was unlike any man she'd known, strong yet gentle, commanding yet kind. She'd caught him watching her sometimes with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, and it stirred feelings she hadn't expected to experience again after the trauma of recent months. The following day brought unexpected excitement. A thunderstorm rolled in during the afternoon, sending ranch hands scrambling to secure equipment and animals. Josephine was in the garden, hurriedly harvesting vegetables that might be damaged by the heavy rain, when Mitchell appeared. "Leave those," he called over the rising wind. "Storm's coming in faster than we thought." No sooner had he spoken than the skies opened, rain falling in sheets. Mitchell grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the house. They were both soaked by the time they reached the porch, laughing breathlessly at their failed attempt to outrun the downpour. "You look like a drowned cat," Mitchell said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Josephine pushed wet hair from her face, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "You're not much better," she retorted, noting how his shirt clung to his broad shoulders. His smile faded, replaced by an intensity that made her breath catch. For a heartbeat, she thought he might step closer, might even miss Josephine. Mrs. Hoffman called from inside. "Are you out there? We need towels before you both catch your death," the moment shattered. Mitchell stepped back, running a hand through his wet hair. "Better get inside," he said, his voice rough. That night, lying awake listening to the storm rage outside, Josephine acknowledged the truth she'd been avoiding. She was falling in love with Mitchell Blackwood. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. She was a penniless orphan with 2 young brothers to raise. He was a successful rancher with responsibilities to his land and legacy. What future could there possibly be in such feelings? Summer deepened into autumn, bringing cooler temperatures and changing the landscape from vibrant greens to golden browns. The cattle drive to market kept Mitchell away for 2 weeks, the longest he'd been absent since bringing Josephine and her brothers to Double B. She was surprised by how much she missed his presence, the sound of his boots on the porch in the evening, his deep laugh when Timothy shared some childhood observation, the quiet moments when they would sit together after dinner while he told her stories of the ranch's history. On the day of his expected return, Josephine found herself checking the horizon more often than necessary. When she finally spotted riders approaching in the distance, her heart leaped embarrassingly in her chest. "They're back," Timothy shouted, racing past her toward the barn where the men would stable their horses. By the time Josephine reached the barn, Mitchell was dismounting. His face weathered from days on the trail, but breaking into a warm smile when he saw her. "Welcome home," she said, suddenly shy under his gaze. "It's good to be back," he replied, handing his reins to one of the ranch hands. "Market prices were better than expected. Good news for Double B." Before she could respond, Timothy launched into excited chatter about the riding lessons Mitchell's father had given him during their absence. Mitchell listened with genuine interest, his hand resting casually on the boy's shoulder in a way that made Josephine's throat tighten with emotion. That evening, after dinner and after the boys had gone to bed, Mitchell found Josephine in the sitting room with her mending. "I brought something for you," he said, producing a small package wrapped in brown paper. "From town." Surprised, Josephine set aside her sewing and accepted the gift. Inside was a book of poetry, Tennyson, one of her favorites that she'd mentioned once in passing. "Mitchell, this is, thank you." She ran her fingers over the embossed cover. "I can't believe you remembered," he shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. "You said your father used to read Tennyson to you as a girl." The thoughtfulness of the gesture moved her deeply. "Would you like to hear some?" she asked impulsively. They sat together while she read aloud, the firelight casting a warm glow over the room. When she finished a particularly beautiful passage, she looked up to find Mitchell watching her with such tenderness that words failed her. "Josephine," he said softly, "I've been wanting to talk to you about something." Her pulse quickened. "Yes," he leaned forward, his expression serious. "These past months, having you and the boys here, it's changed things. Changed me." Before he could continue, the door opened and George Blackwood entered, apologizing for the interruption but needing to discuss an urgent matter about a neighboring rancher's boundary dispute. Mitchell rose reluctantly. "We'll continue this conversation tomorrow," he promised, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer before he followed his father from the room. Josephine barely slept that night, Mitchell's words replaying in her mind. Was it possible he felt the same connection she did? The thought both thrilled and terrified her. Morning brought unexpected news. A telegram had arrived for Mitchell. His sister in Kansas was ill, and he was needed there immediately. He would be gone for at least 2 weeks, possibly longer. "I'm sorry about our conversation," he told Josephine privately before leaving. "When I return, we have much to discuss." The days of his absence stretched endlessly. Josephine threw herself into her work, expanding the garden and helping Mrs. Hoffman preserve vegetables for winter. The boys, now healthy and energetic, continued their lessons and chores, Timothy spending every spare moment with the horses while Samuel devoured books from the Blackwood family library. 2 weeks became 3, then nearly 4, with only brief telegrams updating them on Mitchell's sister's slow recovery. Josephine tried not to worry, tried not to imagine that he might not return at all, that whatever he had meant to say to her that night had been forgotten. It was a crisp November afternoon when she heard hoofbeats approaching. She was in the garden, pulling the last of the root vegetables before the first freeze, and stood quickly, shading her eyes against the low autumn sun. A single rider approached, tall in the saddle, familiar even at a distance. Josephine's heart leaped as she recognized Mitchell, returning at last. He dismounted as soon as he reached the garden gate, his eyes finding hers immediately. There was something different in his expression, a certainty, a purpose that hadn't been there before. "You're back," she said, suddenly breathless. "I am." He stepped closer. "And I've had a lot of time to think while I was away." "Your sister?" Josephine asked, both genuinely concerned and desperate to delay whatever might come next. "Recovering well?" His gaze never left her face. "Josephine, before I left, I was about to tell you something important." She nodded, unable to form words as he took another step toward her. "When I found you and your brothers on that trail, I had no idea how much you would come to mean to me." His voice was low, intimate. "These past months, watching you care for your brothers, work alongside everyone here, bring life back to this house, I've fallen in love with you." The words she had both hoped for and feared hung in the air between them. "Mitchell, let me finish," he said gently. "I know your focus has been on providing for your brothers, on survival. I know romance might be the last thing on your mind, but I had to tell you how I feel and to ask if there's any chance you might someday return those feelings." Tears filled her eyes, not from sadness but from an overwhelming rush of emotion. "Not someday," she whispered. "Now, I love you too, Mitchell, I have for months." The joy that transformed his face was breathtaking. He closed the distance between them, his hands coming up to frame her face with infinite tenderness. "May I kiss you, Josephine Winters?" Her answer was to rise on tiptoes, meeting his lips with her own. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with months of unspoken longing. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as hers wound around his neck. When they finally parted, both breathless, Mitchell rested his forehead against hers. "I should have done that before I left," he murmured. She laughed softly. "Better late than never." That evening, after the boys were asleep, Mitchell and Josephine sat together on the porch swing, her hand in his as they discussed the future. "I want to marry you, Josephine," he said simply. "I want to help you raise your brothers, to build a life here with you at Double B. Are you certain?" She asked, still hardly believing this was real. Taking on a wife is one thing, but two young boys as well. Mitchell smiled, lifting her hand to press a kiss to her palm. "I love those boys nearly as much as I love their sister. They belong here, just as you do." Tears pricked her eyes again. "Then yes, Mitchell Blackwood, I will marry you." Their wedding took place in early December, a small ceremony in the ranch house with only family and ranch hands in attendance. Mrs. Hoffman outdid herself with the wedding feast, and George Blackwood proudly gave Josephine away in place of her father. Timothy and Samuel stood solemnly at their sister's side, dressed in new suits that Mitchell had ordered from Denver. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, both boys cheered louder than anyone, their acceptance of their new brother-in-law complete and wholehearted. That night, after the celebration had ended and they were finally alone in the master bedroom now, there's Mitchell took Josephine in his arms. "When I found you on that trail," he murmured against her hair, "you looked at me with such fierce determination, even while starving. I admired your courage then, but I had no idea I was meeting the woman who would become my heart." Josephine leaned into his embrace, marveling at the journey that had brought them here. "I was so afraid that day, afraid for my brothers, afraid of you, afraid of the future. Now I can't imagine any life but this one. You'll never need to be afraid again," Mitchell promised, tilting her face up to his. "Not while I draw breath." Their kiss sealed the promise, passion mingling with tenderness as they began their life together. Spring arrived the following year, bringing new life to Double B Ranch. Cattle calved, mares foaled, and the garden Josephine had expanded flourished under her care. Timothy, now 9, had become Mitchell's shadow, learning ranching skills with unbridled enthusiasm. Samuel, at 11, divided his time between books and helping with the ranch accounts, showing a head for business that impressed even George Blackwood. And Josephine, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly where their child grew, watched from the porch as Mitchell taught Timothy to throw a lasso in the yard. Her heart was full beyond measure from the starving, desperate young woman on that dusty trail to the wife, sister, and soon-to-be mother she was now. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Blackwood," Mitchell called, noticing her watching them. "Just counting my blessings," she replied with a smile. "And finding them too numerous to count." He handed the rope to Timothy and walked to the porch, taking a seat beside her and placing his hand over hers on her stomach. "How are you feeling today?" "Wonderful," she said truthfully. "Dr. Wilson says everything is progressing perfectly." Mitchell's eyes, those storm-gray eyes that had first captured her attention, crinkled with happiness. "I never thought I could be this happy," he confessed quietly. "Thank you for that gift, Josephine." She leaned against his shoulder, content in the knowledge that hunger of both body and heart was far behind them. "The gift has been mine, Mitchell. You saved us that day on the trail, but you've given me so much more than survival." "We saved each other," he corrected, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And we have a lifetime ahead to be grateful for it." As the sun set over Double B Ranch, painting the sky in the same fiery hues that had captivated Josephine on her first evening there, she knew with absolute certainty that fate had indeed put her exactly where she needed to be in the arms of a cowboy who had seen 3 starving souls on a lonely trail and brought them home to love. Summer turned to autumn, and with the harvest came their daughter, Margaret Rose Blackwood, born with her father's storm-gray eyes and her mother's determination. The birth was difficult, but with Mitchell holding her hand through each pain and misses. Hoffman's experienced assistance, Josephine delivered a healthy, robust baby girl just as the first light of dawn broke over the eastern horizon. "She's perfect," Mitchell whispered, cradling his daughter with hands that seemed suddenly too large, too rough for such a delicate being. His eyes, when they met Josephine's, shimmered with unshed tears. Just like her mother. Timothy and Samuel, who had waited anxiously outside the bedroom door all night, were finally allowed in to meet their niece. Their initial shyness around the tiny infant quickly gave way to fierce protectiveness. "I'll teach her to ride when she's big enough," Timothy declared solemnly. "And I'll teach her to read," Samuel added, not to be outdone. Josephine exchanged an amused glance with Mitchell. "It seems our daughter will have no shortage of teachers," she observed. "Or love," Mitchell added softly. The addition of Margaret Maggie, as Timothy immediately dubbed her, completed their family in a way none of them had anticipated. The little girl became the center of the household, adored not only by her parents and uncles, but by her grandfather and Mrs. Hoffman as well. As Maggie grew from infant to toddler, Josephine sometimes marveled at the changes in Mitchell. The serious, reserved rancher she'd first met had given way to a man who thought nothing of spending an hour on the floor playing with his daughter, or riding with her perched before him in the saddle, her delighted squeals echoing across the ranch. When Maggie was 3, Timothy, now 12 and already showing promise as a horseman, approached Mitchell with an idea that would change their lives once again. "I think we should breed horses," he said one evening after dinner, his young face serious. "Not just for ranch work, but good stock for racing and carriages. There's money in it." Mitchell considered the boy thoughtfully. "It's a big undertaking, would require new pastures, different bloodlines." "I've been reading about it," Timothy persisted, "and talking to Mr. Jackson when he brought that thoroughbred stallion through last month." Josephine, listening from her seat by the fire where she was mending one of Samuel's shirts, recognized the look in Mitchell's eyes, the same one he'd had when he'd first told her he loved her. The look of a man who had made up his mind. "Tell you what," Mitchell said, resting a hand on Timothy's shoulder. "You work up a plan, costs, requirements, potential returns, and we'll discuss it with Samuel and your sister. If it makes sense, we'll give it a try." Timothy's face lit up with excitement. "Really, really," Mitchell confirmed. "This ranch will be yours and Samuel's someday too. About time you started having a say in its direction." The horse breeding operation began the following spring, with Timothy's careful research guiding their initial purchases. Samuel, 14 now, and showing remarkable business acumen, managed the financial aspects while continuing his education through correspondence courses Mitchell arranged from a school in Boston. Double BTK's reputation for quality horses grew steadily over the next few years, bringing new prosperity to the ranch. Maggie, growing into a spirited young girl with her father's confidence and her mother's compassion, delighted in the foals born each spring, naming each one with thoughtful consideration. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, Mitchell took Josephine for a ride to the spot where he had first found her and her brothers. The landscape had changed little, the same rolling hills, the same vast sky overhead, but everything else in their lives had transformed beyond recognition. "Do you ever think about that day?" Mitchell asked as they dismounted, spreading a blanket beneath a solitary oak tree. Josephine sat beside him, leaning against his solid warmth. "Often," she admitted. "I was so afraid, Mitchell, so desperate." He wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "You were the strongest woman I'd ever seen. Half-starved, exhausted, and still standing tall, protecting your brothers." She smiled at the memory. "And you were the answer to a prayer I hadn't dared to speak aloud." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sunset paint the landscape in gold and crimson. "I have something for you," Mitchell said finally, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small velvet box and placed it in her palm. Inside was a delicate gold locket on a fine chain. When Josephine opened it, she found a tiny portrait of their family herself, Mitchell, Maggie, Timothy, and Samuel, painted with exquisite detail. "Mitchell, it's beautiful," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "10 years ago, you gave me a family," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "The greatest gift I could have received." She closed her hand around the locket. "We gave each other a family. Those starving children and I needed you, but I think perhaps you needed us too." "More than I knew," he agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. As they rode back to the ranch in the gathering dusk, Josephine's thoughts turned to the future stretching before them. Timothy, at 19, was already being courted by neighboring ranchers eager to have him train their horses. Samuel, at 21, had recently returned from 2 years at a business college in Denver, bringing new ideas for expanding double BTKS operations. And Maggie, at 7, was the light of their lives, combining her father's quiet strength with her mother's resilience. The main house came into view, lanterns glowing warmly in the windows. On the porch stood their family, George Blackwood, now silver-haired but still straight-backed, Mrs. Hoffman, whose initially temporary position had become permanent, Samuel, tall and serious, Timothy, confident and capable, and little Maggie dancing with impatience at their return. "They're waiting for us," Josephine said, smiling at the sight. Mitchell's hand covered hers on the reins. "They always will be." That night, after the anniversary celebration, and after Maggie had been tucked into bed with a story, Josephine stood at their bedroom window, the locket warm against her skin as she gazed out at the ranch that had become her home. Mitchell came up behind her, his arms encircling her waist as he rested his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about, Mrs. Blackwood?" She leaned back against him, drawing strength from his solid presence as she had for a decade now. "About hunger," she said softly. He stilled. "Hunger. That day on the trail, I thought I knew what hunger was." She turned in his arms to face him. "The physical pain of an empty stomach, the fear of watching my brothers grow weaker, but I've learned there are deeper hungers for love, for family, for purpose." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "And have those hungers been satisfied? Beyond anything I could have imagined." She reached up to touch his face, still handsome despite the lines that 10 years of sun and wind had etched there. "You didn't just save us from starvation that day, Mitchell. You showed me what it means to be truly filled." His kiss was as passionate as their first, 10 years melting away in the heat of their enduring love. Later, lying in his arms, Josephine listened to the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear and knew that no matter what challenges the future might hold, they would face them together, the cowboy and the starving girl he had brought home to his ranch, whose hunger had been transformed into abundance beyond measure. As years passed at Double B Ranch, the legacy Mitchell and Josephine built together continued to flourish. Timothy's horse breeding program became renowned throughout the territory, drawing buyers from as far as California and New York. Samuel's business acumen expanded their operations to include a successful cattle breeding program that complemented the horses. By the time Maggie turned 16 in 1896, Double B had grown to nearly 20,000 acres, employing dozens of hands and supporting multiple families. The original ranch house had been expanded twice to accommodate their growing enterprises, though Mitchell had insisted on preserving the porch where he and Josephine had spent so many evenings together. Josephine, now in her early 40s, had grown into her role as the heart of Double B with grace and wisdom. Her garden had evolved into extensive orchards and vegetable fields that supplied not only the ranch, but the growing town nearby. The simple medical skills she had learned caring for her brothers had developed into a reputation as a healer, with local women often seeking her advice for their family's ailments. "You should have been a doctor," Mitchell told her one evening as she returned from delivering a neighboring rancher's baby. "You've got a gift for healing," she smiled, settling beside him on their porch swing. "Perhaps in another life. In this one, I'm content with what I have." Mitchell's hair had silvered at the temples, and the lines around his eyes had deepened, but his storm-gray gaze was as keen as ever when it rested on her. "And what is that exactly?" he asked, his tone light but his expression serious. "Everything I ever hungered for," she replied simply, taking his weathered hand in hers. "Love, family, purpose, home." Their moment of quiet connection was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching. Maggie appeared around the barn, racing her favorite mare against Timothy's stallion, her laughter carrying on the evening breeze. At 25, Timothy had grown into a handsome young man whose gift with horses had brought him respect throughout the territory. Though several local girls had set their caps for him, he remained devoted to the ranch and his family. Samuel rode more sedately behind them, deep in conversation with a young woman who had recently arrived from Boston to teach at the town's new school. At 27, he had matured into a thoughtful businessman whose innovations had helped Double B prosper even through difficult years. "They've turned out well," Mitchell observed, pride evident in his voice as he watched the three approach. "They have," Josephine agreed. "Though I still remember that first day when they were so thin and frightened." Mitchell's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Do you ever regret it, coming here with a stranger, building this life?" She turned to him, surprised. "Not for a single moment. Why would you ask such a thing?" He shrugged, an uncharacteristic uncertainty crossing his features. "I've been thinking lately about how it all began, finding you on that trail, bringing you here. What if you had other dreams, other plans that got set aside?" Josephine cupped his face in her hands, making him meet her eyes. "Mitchell Blackwood, listen to me carefully. Every dream I've ever had has been fulfilled in this life with you, every single one." The doubt in his expression faded, replaced by the devotion that had sustained them through 2 decades of marriage. "I love you, Josephine. More now than the day I married you." "And I love you," she whispered, sealing the words with a kiss that still held the power to make her heart race. Their quiet moment was broken by Maggie's excited voice as she bounded onto the porch. At 16, she was the perfect blend of her parents Mitchell's height and Josephine's delicate features, with a spirit entirely her own. "Papa, Mama, you'll never guess what happened in town today," she exclaimed, her gray eyes so like her father's sparkling with excitement. Mitchell chuckled. "I suspect you're about to tell us regardless of our guessing abilities." Maggie dropped onto the porch step at their feet. "Mr. Patterson says the railroad's coming through next spring. They're going to build a proper station just 5 miles from here." Samuel joined them, helping the young schoolteacher, Miss Mitchell Winters, no relation to Josephine, though they had joked about the coincidence, up the steps. "It's true," he confirmed. "I've seen the surveys. If all goes according to plan, Double B will be connected to markets all the way to Chicago by this time next year." The implications were significant: faster shipping for their cattle and horses, better access to supplies, increased value for their land. But as Mitchell and Josephine exchanged glances, both knew they were thinking of something beyond business opportunities. Later that night, after the younger generation had retired Maggie to her room, Timothy to the small cabin he'd built near the horse barns, and Samuel to escort Miss Mitchell back to her boarding house in town, Mitchell voiced what they'd both been contemplating. "The railroad will change everything," he said as they prepared for bed. "Bring more people, more development." Josephine nodded, brushing her hair at the vanity he'd given her for their 15th anniversary. "The Wild West isn't so wild anymore, is it?" Mitchell came to stand behind her, their eyes meeting in the mirror. His hands rested on her shoulders, strong and warm. "Do you remember what you said to me that day I found you, when I asked if you and your brothers needed help?" She smiled at the memory. "We're managing just fine, sir," she quoted, "even though we were half dead from hunger." "The proudest woman I'd ever met," he said, his voice soft with admiration. "I knew right then you were extraordinary, and I thought you were either my salvation or my doom," she admitted. "Perhaps a bit of both," he laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest. "Well, which was it in the end?" She rose and turned to face him, twining her arms around his neck. Though they had both aged, the passion between them remained undimmed by time. "My salvation," she murmured against his lips. "Always that." The following spring brought both the promised railroad and unexpected news. Timothy, who had traveled to Kentucky to evaluate potential breeding stock, returned with not only 3 fine mares, but also a wife, Catherine, the spirited daughter of the horse farm's owner, who had captured his heart during his extended stay. "I hope you're not angry we didn't wait," Timothy told Josephine anxiously as he introduced his bride. "Once I asked her father's permission, Kate insisted there was no reason to delay." Josephine embraced her new daughter-in-law warmly. "How could I be angry at gaining another daughter?" she said, genuinely pleased by Timothy's happiness. "Besides, I understand completely. When you know your heart, waiting seems pointless." The young couple established themselves in Timothy's cabin, which they soon expanded to accommodate their growing responsibilities on the ranch. Catherine, raised on her father's horse farm, proved to be as knowledgeable about breeding and training as Timothy himself, and their partnership strengthened the operation considerably. Samuel and Alina's courtship progressed more traditionally, with a formal engagement announced at Christmas and a June wedding planned for the following year. Their complementary temperaments, Samuel's quiet thoughtfulness and Alina's vivacious intelligence, seemed perfectly suited, and Josephine delighted in watching their relationship blossom. Maggie, meanwhile, had developed an unexpected interest in medicine, inspired by her mother's healing work. When she approached her parents about the possibility of attending medical school, a rare but not unprecedented path for women in the late 1890s, Mitchell's immediate support surprised even Josephine. "If that's what you want, we'll find a way," he told his daughter without hesitation. "Double B can spare you for a few years." "You don't think it's improper?" Maggie asked, clearly having anticipated resistance. Mitchell exchanged a glance with Josephine before answering. "Your mother once told me that in another life she might have been a doctor herself. Perhaps you're meant to fulfill that dream for both of you." Tears filled Josephine's eyes at his words and the understanding behind them. Later, when they were alone, she expressed her gratitude for his support of their daughter's ambitions. "You've never tried to limit her," she said as they walked along the creek where they often sought moments of privacy. "Many fathers would." Mitchell shrugged, his expression thoughtful. "When I brought you and your brothers to Double B, I had no idea what the future would hold. I only knew I wanted to help. Everything good in my life has come from that decision, from being open to possibilities rather than clinging to conventions." She squeezed his hand, still strong despite the years of hard work. "You're a remarkable man, Mitchell Blackwood." "I'm a fortunate man," he corrected, "who found a starving family on a trail and gained everything worth having." As Maggie prepared for medical school in Denver, Samuel and Alina were married in a ceremony that filled the ranch with more guests than it had seen since Mitchell and Josephine's wedding 23 years earlier. The young couple would live in the main house until their own home, currently under construction near the orchard Josephine had planted, was completed. Timothy and Catherine announced their first child was expected in the winter, news that filled the entire family with joy. George Blackwood, now in his 70s but still sharp-minded, was particularly delighted at the prospect of another generation at Double B. 5 generations of Blackwoods on this land, he mused during a family dinner, from my father's humble beginnings to this. He gestured around the table at the extended family gathered there. All because my grandson brought home 3 starving souls. Mrs. Hoffman, who had officially retired from housekeeping duties but remained a beloved part of their household, nodded in agreement. I remember that day clear as if it were yesterday. Miss Josephine looking like a strong wind might blow her away, but with fire in her eyes nonetheless. And those 2 skinny boys, George added, smiling at Timothy and Samuel, now grown men with lives and loves of their own. Who'd have thought they'd become the backbone of Double B Ticket's future? I knew. Mitchell said quietly, his eyes finding Josephine's across the table. From the moment I saw how they protected each other on that trail, family like that kind of loyalty is rare. As autumn painted the ranch in golds and reds, Josephine often found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey from that desperate day to the abundant life they now shared. One evening, she sat at her desk, writing in the journal Mitchell had given her on their 20th anniversary, recording not just daily events but the deeper reflections of her heart. Mitchell found her there, reading over her shoulder the words she had just written. Once, hunger was my constant companion, a physical ache that consumed every thought. Now, surrounded by plenty, I understand that the deepest hunger was never for food alone, but for belonging. For love that sees beyond circumstance to possibility. Mitchell didn't just feed our bodies that day, he nourished our souls with dignity, with opportunity, with love that expected nothing in return. What began as survival has blossomed into a legacy that will outlive us both, not merely in land or wealth, but in the values we've passed to our children. Compassion for those in need, recognition of worth beyond status, and the courage to offer help even when the outcome is uncertain. If hunger brought us to this place, then I am grateful even for that desperate time, for without it, I might never have known the fullness of this life, this love, this family that began with a cowboy who saw 3 starving souls on a trail and brought them home. Mitchell's hand came to rest on her shoulder, warm and steady as it had been for nearly a quarter-century. "You writing our story?" he asked, his voice husky with emotion. Josephine covered his hand with hers. "Just remembering where we began." He bent to press a kiss to the top of her head. "The best decision I ever made. For both of us," she agreed, rising to face him. "Who would have thought hunger could lead to such abundance?" Mitchell drew her into his arms, holding her with the same tender strength that had first made her feel safe all those years ago. "I'd say we've both been well fed by this life we've built, Mrs. Blackwood." As they stood together in the golden light of evening, surrounded by the legacy of their love, Josephine knew that the journey from starvation to plenty, from desperation to joy, had given them both the greatest gift of all. A hunger satisfied, a love complete, and a family that had grown from the most unlikely of beginnings into something beautiful beyond imagining. And as the sun set over Double B Ranch, painting the sky in the same fiery hues that had welcomed her on that first evening 25 years ago, Josephine sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for the cowboy who had seen 3 starving souls on a lonely trail and brought them home to love.